Ladies and gentlemen, in this session, From the Red Army to the Israeli Army, Jewish Soldiers Around the Globe, our distinguished panel will examine the experiences of Jewish soldiers serving in armies around the globe. They will address stories of former Polish Jewish refugees serving in the Israeli Army in the early days of the state, Latvian Jews in the Red Army, and women in the Israeli Army. This panel will also discuss how Jewish soldiers responded to extreme situations of trauma and violence. Please welcome Nir Arielli of the University of Leeds, who will serve as the moderator and introduce our panel. Thank you, Nir.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's an absolute pleasure to be joining this fascinating conference. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially Michael Glickman, who's been very busy behind the scenes, as you may have gathered. Our panel today will look at, well, it starts from the Red Army to the Israeli Army, Jewish soldiers around the globe. And it will link Jewish fighters' experiences during the Second World War and the experiences of those East European Jews who managed to make their way to Mandate Palestine and later the State of Israel to fight in the War of 1948. I suggest we hear the presentations in chronological order. So we'll start in just a minute with Professor Havi Dreifuss, Konstantin Fuks, who's joining us from the University of Toronto. And then hopefully we'll finish with Evgeny Finkel, who is joining us from Johns Hopkins University. We'll be taking questions after we've heard from all three of them. So let me briefly introduce our first speaker. It's an honor to be able to introduce Professor Havi Dreifuss. Professor Dreifus is professor of Jewish history and the head of the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland relations at Tel Aviv University, as well as director of the Center of Research on the History of Poland at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Her research deals with various aspects of everyday life during the Holocaust, including the relationship between Jews and Poles. She also looks at religious life in light of the Holocaust and Jewish existence in the face of extermination. Her latest book, The Warsaw Ghetto, The End, from April 1942 to June 1943, won the Shazar Prize for the study of Jewish history and will be published in English soon. Her paper is titled Trauma and Violence as a Fighting Motive, the Case of Polish Jewry. Professor Dreifus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Nir. I'm very happy to be here. And I will start with, wait a second, sharing one thing. Okay, here we are. Sorry. One of the Jewish soldiers who took part in the battle for the liberation of, I'm sorry, I'm starting right away because I know we were asked to leave time for questions, but I am really grateful for having me here, and I thank you all for listening. Okay, so one of the Jewish soldiers who took part in the battle for the liberation of Krakow region and Auschwitz death camp was Max Privler, who testified years later that the images he saw in the liberated camp never left him. By this point, Privler was already a battle-torn soldier who had been wounded several times. According to a decoration he received for his part in these battles of January 1945, he killed 25 enemy soldiers and was a brave and fearless warrior who fulfilled his mission with honors. I am sure that we will hear many similar stories about soldiers in the following days. But what is unique about Max Privler is that he was born in year 1931 in a small village in Poland, Mykolici, not far away from Kolomea. That is, he had a glorious combat history and was one of Auschwitz liberators at the age of 14. Before that, when he was 10, he stood with his father on the verge of a shooting pit. His father was shot to death while protecting him. He saw the brutal murder of his baby brother and the hanging of his mother, and fought for months in partisan units until he was sent to Moscow for medical treatment, where he was trained as a platoon commander for intelligence and sabotage mission behind enemy lines. 14 years old. I'll stop the share for now. So, how do we name Max Privler? A soldier or a fighter? And who were the Jewish soldiers and fighters in Polish context? The easy answer, and the very partial one, I must say, refer to four groups: Jewish soldiers in the Polish army, Jewish soldiers in the Polish army established in France, and those that group fought not only in France, but also in Norway and Syria. They numbered about 14,000 Jews. The Jews in Anders' army, as well as the Jews that served in the Polish People Army. Now, those tens of thousands of Jewish soldiers, and nobody can match the numbers because many of them served in more than one military setting, are only a small part of the Jewish fighters in Poland. The implementation of the final solution was a breaking point regarding many aspects, Jewish resistance included. True, even in the face of extermination, some Jews continued resisting the Nazi ideology and acted in light of human and Jewish values, again engaging in fields of education, culture, documentation, and more. However, facing mass murder, Jewish resistance focused now on survival and revenge. Alongside extensive attempts to accept the murders, many did whatever they could to kill Germans and those who aided them. Those reactions, which ranged from the unprecedented violence, involved a wide range of ages, a variety of political groups, and Jews who did not belong to those frameworks. In some cases, those who led resistance were community leaders, including Judenrat members, Jewish police, rabbis, and women. The very decision to oppose the killings was not trivial and relied primarily on what could be called a communal death insight. That is, a certainty that the entire Jewish public, men and women, young and old, would be murdered regardless of their action. Despite many differences, this insight usually matured among Polish Jews during the second half of year 1942, and due to time limitation, I cannot elaborate how it developed, but if you wish, we can refer to it later on. Above understanding the essence of the final solution, Jewish fighting had a few additional obstacles, including collective responsibility. Jews refrained from attacking the Germans or even fleeing, thinking that their actions might endanger those who remained. At times, this reservation lasted until the destruction of those communities. For example, in the Baranovich Ghetto, the underground postponed the planned revolt under pressure from the Judenrat. And in Brest-Litovsk, it was misled by the Germans and failed to act as intended. Another obstacle for resistance action was timing. Nazi anti-Jewish policy did not develop according to the Allies' achievement on various fronts, and the motivation of Jews to act did not usually match with that of the local undergrounds. Thus, most Jewish resistance, and not only in Poland, did not receive organized support and assistance from the local population. The lack of sympathetic and supportive surrounding merged with other obstacles that significantly limited the range of possible Jewish resistance. Jews were a non-combatant, multi-age civilian population, and only a few of whom who had any military training. And again, I can give endless examples later on. Topography was not always helpful for the Jews either. Large groups could not hide as groups in cities, and thus forest became the main escape destination. However, not all ghettos were established near forest, and long-term survival in the wild was not very simple either. Ultimately, most Polish Jews were murdered even before they knew about the final solution and before they could produce any response. Thus, most acts of resistance were carried out by remnants of the Jews, involving a small portion of the original community. Those Jews who would be murdered later were required to make difficult decisions and different decisions. Should they fight as armed resistance, knowing that their military power is limited and that this act might speed up the murder of other Jews, or should they try and escape, hoping that at least some will survive the war? Should they act jointly and initiate an organized action for all of those temporary survivors, or should a small group of Jews carry out the resistance? Is survival important, or is it the public and symbolic act of fighting the Germans? In this limited framework, I cannot characterize thoroughly the struggle of Polish Jews against Nazi Germany. Still, I do seek to point out two main patterns: that of small communities, mainly in eastern Poland, and the one that developed in larger cities of central Poland. The Tuchen Ghetto numbered about 3,000 Jews. When news of the murder of nearby communities arrived in the summer of 1942, an underground led by the Judenrat chairman Herschel Schwarzmann and his deputy Meir Himmelfarb collected weapons, organized combat groups, and tried to contact Soviet partisans who acted in the area. On September 20th, 1942, when the town's Jews gathered for Yom Kippur prayer, its leaders told them about the approaching murder, declaring that they would set the ghetto on fire and allow the community to flee to the nearby forest. And this was done as planned in the early morning hours of September 24. About 2,000 Jews managed to escape to the forest, while Schwarzmann, Himmelfarb, and all the fighters, as well as 1,000 Jews, were shot in the ghetto. But within 3 days, nearly half of the Jews who fled were captured and shot to death. 300 women and children surrendered themselves to the German after realizing that they would not survive in the forest. Most of the remaining were murdered in the following months, some by the Germans, others by locals, and by the Ukrainian nationalistic partisans. Of the thousands of Jews who were in the ghetto on the uprising, less than 20, I will repeat that, less than 20 survived at the end of the war. Similar, though not identical rebellions involved mass escape occurred in dozens of sites, including Neshvez, Lachva, Mir, Gleboki, and other places. Those communities usually numbered several thousand at most, which enabled them to hope that many members of the community could survive by the revolt. Moreover, even if the forest were later discovered as an illusion and the struggle for survival is an issue for itself, the very existence of those forests shaped a unique Jewish response, an attempt to allow entire communities to escape, or what was left of them. In addition, in many of those ghettos, the resistance was led by the Judenrat and/or the Jewish police, a phenomenon that adds to the complicity of those organizations. Finally, in all of those places, one could find a mixture of fighting and rescue, with the armed struggle perceived as a tool that allowed the escape of many others. It should be stressed that the initial motivation to escape was survival. As a partisan Zerach Arolik testified, if someone tells you, and I'm citing, if someone tells you he joined the partisan because he wanted to fight and take revenge, it is not true. We all left the ghetto hoping to survive, or at least die differently than most Jews. Not to be shot in a mass grave, not to be sent to a concentration camp. End of citation. So, should we call them fighters, soldiers, or something else? In larger ghettos, and here I come to the second pattern, in which even after the initial murder wave, tens of thousands of Jews remained, no one could initiate a joint organized action, and no one could deceive himself that thanks to their action, the majority of the community will be saved. In those larger localities, political movements found it difficult to unite into one underground. Ideological gaps, personal tension, and different organizational perception prevented unification even on the verge of destruction. Moreover, for most of those undergrounds, rescue was not seen as a goal despite its temptation. Knowing that no underground can enable thousands of Jews to escape and other factors rule out the individual survivor. For example, I cannot elaborate here all the wide context of the attempted uprising in Benjin, and still I would like to say that both the leader of the movement outside of occupied Europe and the remnants of the rebels in Warsaw, who were aware of the terrible human cost of the uprising, tried to stop the Benjin underground plans for uprising, asking them to concentrate on saving their own life. Yet those calls were received in Benjin in a terrible rage expressed, and I would like to share my presentation again. those calls to be concentrating on their own lives were received in Benjin in terrible rage, expressed well in Heike Klinger's diary. And I cite, Yitzhak Zuckerman and Tzvi Lubetkin, those very well-known fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto, are very desperate. They changed their mind about the values of defense. They were broken. But should this, asked Klinger, should this change the Benjin underground decision? Should we have lived in the shadow of their glory? Should we have lived at the expense of their death? No, it was worse than humiliation. Indeed, Benjin underground refused to accept outside authority, and their revolt ended in a massacre of the young fighters before they actually had any time to act. And I quote Klinger again, "We should have done something big, no less than in Warsaw. I'm not sorry that they are gone, the friends that were killed, but it hurts, it tears my heart having done so little." End of quotation. For those urban ghettos, mainly in central Poland, rescue was not seen as an option, and their underground often tended to fight the Germans, whether inside the ghetto or outside it, on the Aryan side or as partisans. However, many times the attempt to recruit all the remaining Jews was not simple at all. The general public often perceived the desire to harm the Germans as particularly dangerous. Krakow and Vilnius as famous but not unique examples. In fact, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which I will not be able to expand here, is an exceptional example of a revolt in which the armed fighting of two undergrounds, Rzeszów and Rzeszowo, and the resistance of tens of thousands of Jews to obey German orders integrated. It is this union that gave the rebellion its tremendous impact. Although the fighting activities were the ones that became public, in their ongoing refusal to comply with German demands, even when Inferno closed on them, the masses of Jews became a real obstacle to Nazi authorities. They prevented them from completing the ghetto liquidation as planned. The power of the revolt and its uniqueness actually lies in this combination of the fighting and the mass resistance that provoked such a murderous counter-reaction by the Germans in Warsaw. So, regular soldiers were part of Polish Jewish resistance, and fighting was much more than an act expressed in the battlefields. Polish Jewish resistance emerged not only from the military units, but mainly from the trauma of the mass murder, and thus had many faces. Jews tried to escape, to stay, to lie, to tell the truth. They tried to act with determination, courage, resourcefulness. They tried to evoke pity, compassion, and even fear. They tried to arouse human conscience that was such a rare commodity in wartime days. Yet during the Holocaust, even the most heroic acts or those of the greatest self-sacrifice ended in the death of the most beloved ones. In the murderous reality created in World War II, not only the law of war lost validity, but also the basic definitions of what a soldier is. Thus, I would like to end my part in the following question. What did Jews fight against? The German army or the German ideology as an instance? How did they resist this, whatever thing they resisted to? By armed resistance, rescue, in the ghetto, forest, or in the camps, something that we haven't even touched here? And what made their fighting so Jewish? Their origin, their goal, something else? I think that the Polish case, which has much more to do with trauma and violence than with soldiers, raises a few possible and complicated answers to those initial questions. Thank you very much.
Very much, Javi, for that fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. We're going to move now to our second speaker. So this is almost soon to be Professor Konstantin Fuks. Konstantin is a doctoral candidate in history and in the collaborative program in the University of Toronto. He's currently completing his dissertation titled The Soviet-Latvian War Effort, Experiencing, Remembering, and Narrating the History of the Second World War. At the core of his dissertation is the largely untold story of many Latvians of mostly marginalized origins who supported Stalin's revolution from abroad in 1940 and later joined the ranks of the Red Army to participate in the Second World War, on the side, of course, of the Soviet Union and Allied forces. I'll hand over to Konstantin now to tell us about Facing the Bitter Truth, Latvian Jewish soldiers of the Red Army confront the Holocaust.
Thank you, Nir, and hello, everyone. I hope that the presentation file is on. With the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, many Latvian Jews joined the Red Army. They crossed the Latvian border twice. The first time they left as refugees, evacuees, and fighters. The second time they came back wearing the uniform of the Latvian Rifle Corps of the Red Army in the summer of 1944. They went through places where they lived and often learned about the murders of Jews from locals. Some recorded their first impressions in letters and sent them to evacuated families. A group of soldiers was interviewed by Moscow historians from the Commission on the History of the Great Patriotic War immediately after the war. Along the letters from the front, these stories represent the earliest and very intimate reactions of Latvian Jewish soldiers to the Holocaust. Although most of them knew about the murders, thanks to the Soviet war propaganda, they were not prepared for the intimate details of tragedy. Facing the bitter truth was an extremely traumatic experience for soldiers that would leave a deep imprint on their. The arrival of Stalin's revolution in June 1940 and the destruction of Ulmanis' state and its political class may have led to a faster Holocaust in Latvia. Indeed, there were enough local pioneers of the Holocaust willing to kill the Jews from the early days of the German invasion. And yet, joining the Soviet Union was a blessing for survival. Many Latvian Jews had a choice to flee or join the resistance. When the war broke out, for most Latvian Jews, the decision to evacuate was not a dilemma. It was a matter of time, place, and logistics. Of the 1904,000 Latvian Jews, about 70,000 Jews were killed in Latvia. About 15 to roughly 20,000 left as refugees, evacuees, and fighters. They joined the recent Jewish deportees on the Soviet home front. And about 5,000 Jews joined the Red Army and over 2,000 died. Indeed, there was a huge desire to fight. The Latvian division of the Red Army became a place where Jews could fight alongside their friends and relatives. Many fought for their new Soviet motherland, but a lot of them were fighting for sure survival in the global war against fascism. Concerns about the fate of relatives and friends during the evacuation was a recurring motif in the soldiers' letters. Rumors about the fate of those left behind were rather pessimistic. As Jan Fried wrote to his uncle Wolf, quote, "There is one soldier in my division who lived in our house, but he doesn't know anything about our relatives. If you remember, Donchen and Ardov lived in our house too. They evacuated. I think our aunt Fania evacuated with them too, but I'm very worried about the fate of your brother, Uncle Elus, and the rest. They probably all perish in the hands of the Germans," he concluded bitterly. The desire to settle scores with the Germans was huge. Besides, the motive of revenge didn't emerge in a complete ideological vacuum. The revenge was largely promoted by the Soviet war propaganda as a response to German brutality against Soviet citizens, including Jews. This campaign included animated articles by Ilya Ehrenburg. His skill to kill a German in July 1942 made a great impression on many Latvian Jewish soldiers. "My dear," wrote Yankel Rafferson to his wife, "if you only this in the human shape," he encouraged her to read the newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda because it featured Ehrenburg's articles. Even animals sometimes spare us. These monsters kill children in front of their mothers. Everything. The tears of our mothers and our shattered and broken lives will cost them. By the summer of 1943, Latvian Jews in evacuation and at the front began to receive more detailed information about the murder in Latvia. In April 1943, the Latvian Central Committee sent Malenkov a chilling report on German-occupied Latvia, which stated that all remaining Jews, with the exception of a few hundred who remained in Riga and Liepāja, were brutally murdered. Articles by JAF member philosopher Max Privler about the murder of Jews in Latvia were published by the Sovinform Bureau abroad and in Einakide in 1943 and 44. Reactions to new information are well preserved in the letters from the front. On May 5th, 1943, medical instructor Eva Vater wrote to her friend, quote, "Today is my mother's birthday. I would better not evoke it. It won't be easy. But I know that out of 60,000 Jews, Hitler left only 400 Jews in Riga, which of course means that the parents of the communist, her brother Yuri, and the Komsomol member herself did not survive. Didichka, we will take revenge on the dumb Finns," she concluded. Next slide. During the Soviet advance westward in 1944, Red Army soldiers passed through liberated areas and confronted the results of German atrocities against Soviet civilians. The experience of Latvian Jewish soldiers was unique because they passed through the areas in which they lived before the war and learned about the killings of Jews, sometimes from their neighbors. The return home was both thrilling and terrifying, but the gruesome reality of Latvia without Jews hit them like a truck. When entering Eastern Latvia in July 1944, many wanted to visit their hometowns. "I'm still alive. I'm fighting on Latvian soil," Iraida Pliner wrote to her friend in Moscow. "It's a pity that our unit didn't go to Rezekne. Otherwise, I would have run home." Captain Nahum Rauchman was more successful as his unit took part in the liberation of his childhood hometown Kruspils. He went to inspect specifically the town to only find out that his 4 sisters with their entire families were shot there. Then he learned that his 9-year-old son, who was left behind in Madona during the evacuation from Riga, was killed too. He initially fled to the forest but was murdered later. Devastated, Rauchman wrote a letter to his older daughter, who wanted to return to Riga, preparing her for the harsh reality of the consequences of the German occupation. Quote, "No, that there are no relatives. There is no Sominka. There is no one from our family. I have not found them, and no one else will find them. You must know this in advance and be ready for it. As a result, it may turn out, just as it happened with others and with me, that the city will seem native and alien at the same time. That is the truth, my girl. You're already an adult and you should understand this. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't come back," he assured, encouraging her to participate in the rebuilding. When on October 13th, 1944, the Red Army liberated Riga, Captain Gary Baskin couldn't wait to go to his city. He thought that he had already come to terms with the loss of his parents. He dreamed of a new life in Riga with his frontline friend Tanya after the war. On October 15th, Baskin wrote her a letter from his hometown that no longer felt like his own. Quote, "And the last, the scariest part, I was in the house where the surviving Jews who miraculously escaped from the Germans are staying now. Out of 194,150 remain, 150. All the rest were killed and shot by the Germans, including my parents. According to the stories of the survivors, the Germans committed monstrous atrocities. I don't want to repeat all these words. This is Majdanek, Lublin. The Germans will pay for this." Baskin wrote, evoking Ehrenberg's article about hundreds of small Majdaneks created by the Germans in the occupied Soviet territories and in other countries. "Blood and tears, impressions when I return home," he wrote bitterly. "Currently, I myself do not know what to say. It has become somewhat alien to me. Imagine I was offered 4 days of vacation. I declined. I gave them up. Why do I need vacation? Where will I go? Will I do? Everything here is so familiar and yet others learn details of the massacres of the Jews from locals, neighbors. October 17th, he went to Riga. He ran to his apartment, naively hoping to see his family alive. "I just couldn't resist," he recalled. "I have never experienced such joy as when I entered the city. I thought my relatives and friends were there, but I was so disappointed I haven't found anyone." His neighbors told him about the murder of his father in July 1941 by the police because of his party membership. He then learned about the death of his mother and sisters, including their 4 children, in the Riga ghetto during the first phase of the Rumbala massacre on November 29, 1941. With a sense of guilt that he couldn't save his family, his parents, he recalled, quote, "When neighbors told me how my mother and sisters were sent to the ghetto, when they told me about my mother shot inside the ghetto, I didn't cry, but it was as if they were cutting me alive." The stories of Jewish survivors on how they were treated by some Latvians deeply affected Amdur. The best case was indifference. At worst, an expression of happiness and joy about the fate of Jews. "Honestly," he admitted, "I saw a lot in the battle, but when I heard stories, the city seemed to be not native, but completely alien." And this is the kind of a in the letters and the wartime recollections. For many, indeed, the purging of Latvia from Jews was devastating and alienating. Perhaps later, Baskin wrote his Tanya, when everything is restored, when the people return from our Soviet rear, when the wounds heal, things will be different. Maybe we will go back to Riga. But for now, there is nothing to do in the city where I once lived, loved, and rejoiced. Nothing is left. Feelings of guilt for leaving people behind haunted soldiers. It was this intimate knowledge of the details of the killing that made communists like Amdur mobilize and take responsibility for finding surviving Jews in Riga. Together with Major Yehuda Negev and Sergeant Israel Friedman, they helped organize the registration office for the surviving Jews of Riga at Terbata Street. There were no Jews in Latvia at all. Only in Riga I found 152 Jews, Amdur recalled. They escaped in different ways. Some lived underground, some lived with Latvians, and some bought themselves out. One guy told me that they lived underground for almost 2 years. They didn't see the light of God. They were pale, so pale. Facing the bitter truth invoked the struggle for identity and belonging. Some of the surviving Red Army soldiers from the Zionist movement believed that they had no future in Latvia. They later moved to Palestine through the Brecha movement, but the vast majority tried to rebuild their new life in Soviet Latvia. Many soldiers confirmed that when the people began to return from evacuation, some parents, some wives with children, life in capital letters began to prevail over death in the post-Holocaust Latvia. If there was any correlation between the increasing knowledge on the tragedy and the self-identification of some soldiers as Jewish, I think it was due to their intimate connection to the locality and the victims of the mass killings. I think even for the most ardent Soviet patriots, the killing of Jews was a distinct phenomenon of the war, which forced them to rediscover their Jewishness in a very intimate, albeit negative way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. So we are now joined by our third and last speaker, Evgeny Finkel, who is an associate professor of international affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. He is author of Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2017. And together with Scott Gelbach, of the book Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2020. His current research, and that's the research he's going to tell us about, focuses on Holocaust survivors who fought in the 1948 war in Israel-Palestine. Professor Finkel, the floor is yours.
We are having some technical difficulties for Professor Finkel. I wonder if you can unmute yourself, Professor, and though we might not be able to see you on the screen, we should be able to hear you. Perhaps one of our tech support colleagues on the back end can unmute Professor Finkel. Okay, as we try to work this through, let's pivot a bit for a moment over to some of the questions that have come in, and perhaps Nir, you might be able to see some of these questions and help bring them to our panelists.
Yeah, okay. So I'll provide some very sort of brief commentary just as a way of preparation for the last paper. So, I mean, after the war ends, after the Second World War ends, hundreds of thousands of East European Jews who survived the Holocaust begin to become released from the camps, emerge from hiding, and begin to return from exile in the Soviet Union. Konstantin alluded to this, so there's the process of bricha, of escape, that begins to emerge. But just to begin with, it's more of a kind of a grassroots organization that's really led by survivors, and with time it kind of comes under the sort of the patronage, the control of emissaries from the Yishuv, some emissaries from Palestine, and it brings us hundreds of thousands of Jews to Central Europe, to Allied occupied Europe. We have other Jews who remain in the countries of Eastern Europe, so in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, and in Hungary. And some of these felt compelled to go to Israel at a time when the newly established state was fighting for its survival. I can see Professor Evgeny Finkel has been able to join us now. Evgeny, are you ready to present your paper? I think you might want to unplug your earphone so we can hear you. Now we do, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Just let me pull up the presentation and I will be with you. And again, I apologize for all the technical stuff that happened. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is a part of a book project I'm working on for several years, right? Holocaust survivors who fought in 1948 war in Israel-Palestine. How it started and what this project is about? Well, it started from my work on my previous book, Ordinary Jews of Jews in several ghettos. And for that project, I went over literally thousands and thousands of testimonies, of survivors' testimonies. And the quite typical story was along the lines, well, I was in this camp or that camp or in the Soviet Union, and then 1947, 1948, I came to Israel, fought in the war, but you know what? Let me tell you about the family I built in 1950s. And as a social scientist, there was a red bulb that immediately went on. What's going on here? First, I did numbers to be so high. And second, the silence. The silence definitely caught my attention. Those people talked, for hours about very painful stuff. So why wouldn't they talk about the 1948 war? What is about the war that makes it so special? So I started investigating and trying to understand the story of those people. And more specifically, I wanted to answer several questions. The most one was whether the Holocaust experience made the behavior and the attitude of IDF soldiers who survived the Holocaust different from the behavior of the non-survivor comrades, of those who came before the war, were born in Palestine, and more specifically, what the effects of the Holocaust on behavior and attitudes towards the in-groups, other soldiers, other Jews, but also what we call in social scientists out-groups. In this context, the Arabs among the Holocaust survivors in the IDF, and if there were differences, then how durable they were. Was it something very short-lived, or did it endure even after those people learned the language, became acclimated to life in the military, got to know Israel? And there is actually quite a lot of research, mostly in psychology, but also in other social sciences, about the impact of exposure to violence and exposure to trauma. And quite a lot of that actually comes from research on Holocaust survivors. It goes in waves. And the first perspective was that exposure to violence has very significant negative effects. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term PTSD and also survival guilt/syndrome, or what the economists call development in reverse, both personal development, but also social development. And then in 1990s and early 2000, a second wave came that started challenging those arguments. And what they find that actually exposure to violence, even extreme violence, has
We continue to have a few technical problems for Professor Finkel, so we're going to turn it back over to you, Nir.
Okay, so I think in the meantime, until we get Professor Finkel back online, I have a few questions both for Javi and for Konstantin. So I think I'll just ask those if that's okay. So first of all, and this is sort of with my military historian hat on, so apologies, but a question for both of you. If you can give us a sense of, obviously exact numbers are difficult, but a sense of the number of Jewish fighters that we're talking about in each of the case studies. So the number of ghetto resistors in Poland, even a ballpark figure. And Konstantin, for you, how many Latvian Jewish soldiers are we talking about? Javi, a follow-up question for you, if I can. So you talked about 1942 as this kind of pivotal moment when realization begins to sink in. And I'm wondering we have...
I'm back, and again, I apologize, even the Johns Hopkins University Wi-Fi doesn't like me today.
Okay,
So,
carry on. We'll continue with the questions later on.
Yeah. So, and then the most recent, probably my Wi-Fi connection got cut when I was talking about, the more recent research that finds mostly positive effects of exposure to violence, including the Holocaust. It increases trust, it increases pro-social behavior, and then the most recent findings are somewhere in between, a middle road between this mostly negative and mostly positive perspective, and what the most recent current research finds is the mixed attitudes. Mostly exposure to violence has positive attitudes towards in-group, so people become more likely to behave pro-socially, to have high levels of trust towards their in-group, but has negative attitudes towards the out-group. They start hating everyone else. And I wanted to see how Holocaust survivors in the IDF fit or do not fit those arguments. So what exactly are the numbers that we're talking about? How many people? And that's actually one of the things that did surprise me. The number was quite substantial. And that's typically not how the history of the 1948 war is taught in Israel. Now, we don't have precise numbers on the pre-statehood period, but after the creation of Israel, let's say about 25–30% of the IDF were Holocaust survivors. It was even higher in frontline units. Some brigades, such as Givati or Negev Brigade, were almost majority Holocaust survivors, and that's not something that most people in Israel or elsewhere know. And importantly, Holocaust survivors in the IDF were not a uniform group. Some came to Palestine several years before the war, 1945 to 1947. Some were new immigrants who didn't know the language, and for them, the typical experience would be they would get to Haifa. 24 hours later, they would be on uniform. 40 hours later, they would be in their unit in the front line. And there was also a difference between the experiences during the Holocaust. Some survived ghettos and camps, some escaped to the Soviet territory, but all of them saw very high levels of violence, no matter how they survived the Holocaust. So what I did, what is the data that I used for this project? First, there are several large-scale Israeli projects on the so-called 1948 generation, Dor Tashach, and quite a few of those interviews are available online, and many of those people are Holocaust survivors. In typical Holocaust survivors' testimonies, even when they talk about the Holocaust, about a third of the interview is devoted to post-Holocaust experience. And if people fought in the war, then in those parts, they would be talking about their experiences as well. But most importantly, over the last several years before the coronavirus hit, I would spend a week or two every 2-3 months in Israel, finding and interviewing people who are Holocaust survivors who fought in the IDF. And I conducted about 50 such interviews. The youngest person I interviewed was 88 at the time of the interview. The oldest was 96, 97. They spanned the entire spectrum from pretty famous people like Yitzhak Arad to the ordinary foot soldiers. And in the Q&A, I will be more happy to talk about the methodological issues and the biases of doing this kind of research based on interviews about something that happened many years ago. So several observations about what I find. First, there are huge differences in what survivors say depending on the source, time, and importantly, the language. Things that people would freely discuss with me in Hebrew would never come up in English language interviews, especially those done on video. And this is especially true for sensitive topics. But more generally, first, there was very huge differences within those groups. We usually tend to think about Holocaust survivors as more or less uniform group. And here we're even talking about an even narrower group, largely younger males. But even with those groups, where they spent the Holocaust years and how they survived the Holocaust, to a large extent determined how they would behave and how they would feel later on. The impact of the Holocaust on trust. Uniformly across the board, there was some short-term negative experience of the Holocaust on trust, both towards in-group and out-group. But if those people were placed in a stable environment, then most visible expressions of this lack of trust and antisocial behavior would disappear. If they were not provided with this stable environment, they would continue. Now, what kind of negative effects I'm talking about? Minor crime, especially minor crime within the units. Theft from other soldiers, theft from Arab houses in abandoned villages, informing on other soldiers, and also unwillingness to talk about what they experienced because people would not understand. That's also an impact of the Holocaust on trust. Those people were not trusting anyone to share their stories back then. But here a lot depended on the commander and how the unit was structured. If the commander understood that the survivors have special needs, then most those effects would disappear and people would open up, the discipline would improve, and social relations between the unit would improve. Also, if there were very few survivors in the unit, or they were a majority of the unit, those effects would disappear. Where we do see most of those negative effects is where in the unit where was a large number of survivors, but they were still a minority. That would be a pretty typical infantry unit, and that's where most of those negative effects, and again, I'm talking mostly about self-reported negative effects. So when I'm talking about looting from Arab houses or blowing up Arab houses, that's what survivors themselves told me. What about pro-social behavior? Well, here we have an ultimate test. There is no behavior more pro-social and more pro-group than fighting for the state. And here even among those who fought in combat frontline units, and even those who received decoration, I did find that many, even those who fought bravely and even stayed in the military for many years after the war, they reported that they had absolutely zero desire to join the war or to get drafted. They were drafted against their will. That was especially true for those who were older or those who came after May 1948. Those who came before did often talk about their desire to join the military, to join the Palmach, but here the motivations were not ideological, not pro-social, but more private motivations. For instance, they had no place to live. They just come to this country. They have no relatives. The military at least will feed them or will give them a bed, will give them a bunk, will give them a roof over their head. Some reported volunteering for pretty dangerous missions. So that's also an example of very pro-social behavior. But when you ask them, well, why did you do so? The answer would be, after Auschwitz, I couldn't care about death. So I would do anything. Or another example, military careers. Quite a few of people I interviewed chose military careers after the war, remained in the military for many years. Some of them reached pretty high ranks of colonels and generals. When I asked them, well, why did they join? The answer was, there was nothing for me on the outside. That was the only life I knew. It was not about ideology. It was not about commitment. It was mostly about their private motivation. No, not taking leaves, staying on the base even when they could go to the town or could go to their homes, and many of their comrades did so. Well, Holocaust survivors often did not. When I asked them, well, why? And that's something that their commanders often noticed, and it would appear in the media. But it wasn't an example of how ideologically motivated they are or how they love the military. They just didn't have anywhere to go to. So for them, the option of taking a leave and go home for a weekend was just not there. So even quite a few of those pro-social behaviors, when we dig deeper, when we scratch behind the surface, appear something quite different. And the question that I honestly was mostly interested in was the attitude toward Arabs. Now, social science literature would predict that exposure to violence would lead to more negative attitudes towards Arab. There is also a moral, non-empirical argument about, well, how Jews who suffered so much can inflict violence on others. And again, here we're talking about Holocaust survivors. So that argument would if this argument is correct, then we should probably see more sympathy towards Arabs and especially Arab civilians. What I found? Nothing. Those people simply did not care. For them, it was not an issue, not because they did not know what was going on, not because they did not see the violence, not because they did not see abandoned villages. Itzhak Arad himself spent about half an hour telling me how he and another future prominent historian, Yavetz, blew up an abandoned Arab village house by house in 1947. No, for them it was just not an issue because they were too preoccupied with trying to recover from the Holocaust and trying to live their lives. It was not something on their mind. And that was an answer that I got from people who are currently either very left-wing or very right. Absolutely no problem share their views. As of now, they're more than willing to talk politics, but when I asked them about 1947, 1948, the answer was, yeah, I didn't care. I have bigger stuff on my life. On my mind. I need to recover from the Holocaust and try to rebuild my life. So just to conclude, well, how did the Holocaust experience affect Israeli soldiers, survivors who fought in the IDF? Certainly it did, but it did so in ways that are much more nuanced than those who usually come to mind. Not the political or ideological ways, but more personal ways, more personal impact that manifested itself in day-to-day behavior rather than the big stuff that historians or social scientists often focused on, like politics or ideology or attitudes. So, but here I am only at the beginning of the road. I'm just starting analyzing the data. So those are only initial observations, and I hope to share more as I move forward, and happy to answer any questions you might have. And again, I apologize for all the technical stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evgeny. Okay, so I think I will return to the questions I started posing, and then I'm happy to collect questions from the audience. Okay, so I asked already both Javi and Konstantin about numbers. So Evgeny, if you could also, you said about 25 to 30% of the IDF. So if you could later give us an indication about how many that amounts to. And then, Javi, I was in the process of asking you about late 1944 and early 1945. So once the Red Army begins its advance through Poland, you made the very kind of moving point about survival being a key motivation over everything else. But once the tide turns, does revenge begin to play a greater role in the last part of the war for the survivors? Konstantin, for you, you mentioned briefly a few of the veterans joining Bricha. If you could say a little bit more about their role and their experiences, again, towards the end of the war after liberation. And a question for you, Evgeny, if I can. So how many of these Holocaust survivors had military experience that they had received, either joined the Haganah having arrived from Europe earlier, or if they arrived just at the beginning or during the war, if they had received any training in DP camps in Europe? So Javi, if you don't mind going first.
So first of all, when I was speaking, one said that I spoke too quickly, which of course is true. And actually one of the slides I forgot to share is the following one, which presents some numbers. All of them are very problematic. For example, talking about 5,000 of the Anders army, of course, it's very questionable because some of those people were civilians and not soldiers. But my main claim is not it's only a problem of those numbers, and not the fact that some of those Jews served not only in the Polish army, but later on in other frameworks. My main claim, which I was trying to say, is that this is only part of the fighting. So you have tens of thousands of soldiers, of Polish Jews who fought in this or that military organization. And of course, you have to include all of those Polish Jews who later on enlisted to the Soviet army as well. But I would say that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who resisted in different ways. And here I want to stress that I think that this discussion, at least in the Polish case, has much more to do regards reactions to Nazi ideology and Nazi policy than to fighting itself. So that is one thing. Now, and of course I can elaborate, but I know others need to answer as well. Another thing is a question of revenge. Now, of course, revenge is very, very important before as well. We have partisan units who are taking revenge of locals. It could be Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainian, others who are known as harming Jews. And actually, and here I refer to the opening session, some of those Jews were later asked to be seen as war criminals. So we have here the question, who is the hero and who is the criminal? Because on the other hand, at least in the Polish region, you have some very well-known Polish heroes that from Jewish perspective were very much different than heroes and actually were murderers. So revenge was before 44 and 45 as well. And you sure have people, the most famous example, of course, is Kovner and the question of trying to find revenge of those Kvutzot of Nakam. But there were many other kinds of revenge. And again, here I think that terms of fighting and even of Amida, of the term Amida, many times narrow our understandings. And I think we should refer to it as part of Jewish reactions, which could be very different and include different motives. Revenge is only one of them.
Do we have Konstantin? I don't see him on the screen.
It looks like he fell off.
Okay, so over to you, Evgeny, if that's okay.
So thank you. So I have to admit that my Wi-Fi kicked me out of the chat once again. So I got part of your question about the numbers, but
yeah. So two things. First of all, about the numbers. So how much does 25-30% of the IDF amount to? And secondly, how many of them did receive some military training before being thrown onto the front line?
Right. So the number. So then, in terms of numbers overall, and again, that's a very imprecise estimate because we don't know the exact numbers for the pre-1948. I would say that about 35,000-40,000 soldiers in the IDF were Holocaust survivors, and by Holocaust survivors I mean those who were in Europe on September 1st, 1939, and either lived under German occupation or had to escape invading German forces. In terms of military experience, quite a few of them did, though they were a minority, and those people did receive a very different treatment, especially if they came before 1948. For them, the door to the Palmach was open, and quite a few of them reached permanent position. But again, they were a minority. A majority did not have any military experience whatsoever. The only military training that they got was in the camps, in the DP camps in Europe, without weapons by and large, and about a day of training in what is now Beit Lid in central Israel, and that's pretty much it.
Konstantin, you're back with the question, or are you okay?
Yeah. I remember there were two, for example, in number and numbers. Clear 5,000 Jews fought in the Red Army. Also, over 2,000 of that's 1% of the entire population. Soviet Union Army during the Second World War. So it's a tiny population, Soviet Union population, but still we have to keep in mind that first war, a lot of Jews volunteered to join the Latvian division of the Red Army, and almost over 1,700 Jewish soldiers participated in 70% of the entire division. So, and a lot of them was the members of Tnuah, Beitarim, Poale, left Chinese organizations. A lot of Latvian Jews who were Zionists at the time did join from their and a lot of them died in the first month. So certainly for this particular group of soldiers and their families, families fund to communists, and sometimes within the family they all had those kind of interesting questions. There was no question that they need to fight. There was a need to fight, volunteer. But if you know that there was a big research conducted by Dov Levin after the war with all those members of Tnuah who later on moved to Israel through the Bricha movement. Yeah, of course. And then they are all oral histories that at some particular moment of time, close to war, felt kind of a sense of withdrawal, and they just wanted to finish it soon and move on. Of course, they didn't find themselves, or they didn't find Latvia as a future place to stay. And of course, some of the Jews who evacuated to the depths of the Union, with Zionists, explored the links and the possibilities of Bricha through Afghanistan to join possibly the corps in Palestine. Experience and extreme situations, also repressed for doing so black and white. But a lot of Jews, regardless of the political affiliation, the Germans, and I've read hundreds of letters, memoirs who were left. They expressed that sense of urgency that they needed to fight. Definitely, some fought for the new Soviet motherland, and some fought for the ship. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to collate some of the questions from the chat. So there's a question for Evgeny about the myth of Latrun and the role of Chativa Sheva, Brigade 7. So if you can say a few words about that from your interviews.
Right. So I in my interviews, I think I came across only on one or two people who were in Latrun, and Chativa Sheva actually was not in the 7th Brigade. There were not that many survivors. The typical survival story would be, or a typical survivor assignment would be, infantry brigades rather than motorized infantry or future tank brigades like the 7th Brigade, but more generally on Latrun. So for those who don't know the backstory, Latrun is considered well, it is a myth. First of all, of how the state of Israel mistreated survivors and how they were sent to die in a disastrous battle of Latrun and were slaughtered in huge numbers. Well, I think the consensus is, and I'm not a military historian, so I haven't looked at the documents, but from what I understand, the consensus is that it is a myth, that it was a disastrous battle, but there was no intention to send people from the ships as cannon fodder, and certainly the number of people, especially Holocaust survivors, who were killed in the battle is several dozen rather than huge numbers than is common in the typical Israeli, not imagination, but myth making. So that's on Latrun, I think. Okay. But again, it's not something I explicitly looked at from my interviews.
Understood. Another question for you. Does your research consider how Holocaust survivors or survival influenced early Israeli tactics and doctrine?
I'm not sure I can think. So first of all, my research is on a very micro level. I want to understand those people rather than the state, and especially not the tactics. But again, based on my research, I don't think there is much tactical influence to speak of. On the general level, it did exist on the unit level, where people brought their experience, often from the woods, being partisans, or from the military to the units. So that I did see, but not something centralized and organized, at the tactical staff level.
Okay, good. Thank you. There's more questions for you, I'm afraid. So first of all, is there data on Red Army soldiers who served after being liberated from Transnistria?
Good question, but I honestly do not know.
Okay, fair enough. Then follow up to that, could you give examples of what people said in Hebrew rather than did not say in other languages?
Oh, so again, in Hebrew, people would talk quite explicitly about, shooting POWs, blowing up our houses, and that again, something that Yitzhak Harat told quite extensively how he and Professor Yavitz blew up an Arab village as a revenge for the 35 convoy Sharat al-Ahmed Hay, and then according to Yavitz, apparently they blew up their own village. But by the way, Yitzhak disputed that. Yitzhak was adamant that the village was correct, but that's not something that I found in either of their publications or interviews or stories in English. In Hebrew, it's in the Palmach archive. Again, Arad was very happy to talk about that. In Hebrew, some cases of sexual violence, some cases of sympathy towards the Arabs, and using the words like ghetto to describe, the siege of Ascalon and expulsions. That's not something that I saw in any interview done in the English language when those people moved to the West and gave interviews from the US. And there is a number of people who fought in the war and then immigrated to the US and Canada, and they have their interviews, their Holocaust interviews. They would not even go near those topics. Israeli Holocaust survivors would be also more circumspect, especially in the interviews done in 80s or 90s, but it would still be more open. Right now, I was talking to people who know that they're in the end of their life, and many of them actually never shared the story of 1948. They were used to talking about the Holocaust, but 1948 was not something that anyone asked them about. So, in some of those, they would even gather their families, and their families would hear the story for the first time. So those are kind of sensitive stuff that would, stealing from other soldiers, or either as a perpetrator or as a victim when other soldiers stole from them. That would be quite openly discussed in Hebrew, but not in English. absolutely not.
Thank you. So I believe we are out of time. So I would like to thank all the participants for their really thought-provoking papers. Hopefully the technical glitches haven't sent people away. Michael, I'm handing back to you, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Nir. And thank you all for participating in what was a really thoughtful and wonderful panel. We are going to take a 30-minute coffee break. And during that time, we encourage you all to check out the lobby, visit the information provided by the Blavatnik Archive, visit our Veteran Memories Project, which is a new initiative of the Blavatnik Archive, and check out our cultural partners. The next session, which is Who Were the Jews in the Red Army, will start promptly at 1:45, and we look forward to welcoming you all back at that time. Thank you.